day 2 of the Julia Sew Along. We have completed the bodice yesterday, and now I am ready to move on to the skirt. And the first thing to do with the skirt is the pockets. Now you remember we cut the curve out of the upper corners of our front skirt pieces. I didn't mention, but I probably should have, that you actually don't cut it out of the lining. It is just for the outer skirt that we're doing and just for the front skirt. So anyway, first thing to do is to put your piping on this curved edge. So my piping has already been trimmed to 1/4 inch, and I've also ironed a little bit of a curve in it in the direction that I needed it to go. So we're going to do this just like we did the yoke with one of these glue stick pins. And I'm going to do it on the actual curve of the dress rather than the piping this time. Either way works. So just a little bit of glue on there. And it can be pressed in place. Right like that. That nice and flat. Now I'm going to take it to my machine and I'm going to stitch it using that pin tuck foot to stitch right along the stitching line of the piping to get this all stitched into place. Once I've done that, it's going to look like this. This one has already been stitched in place. And the next thing to do at that point is to trim these long edges off so that it lines up with the side of the dress. So I've got each of these to trim off and probably a few stray threads as well. And then the next thing that you always do with the ends of piping whenever it's going to be stitched into a garment is you pull out the inside of the piping cording from the piping. Pull it out about, well, really whatever your seam allowance is, about 1/4 inch at least. But I happen to know that my seam allowance up here is going to be 1/2 inch. I'm going to actually pull this out a little bit more than that. It's going to be more like 1/2 inch. And I'm going to clip it and then pull it back in there. So this little section right here actually doesn't have any cording in the piping there. And that's going to make it a little bit flatter for our seams later on once we sew two fabrics together there. So I'm going to do the same thing on this corner, pulling out a little bit. Now the seam allowance on this side is only 1/4 inch, so I'm not going to clip as much of that off. But anyway, now it can be straightened out. And so that's what we have. So after you've done, stitched your piping into place, trimmed the ends of it off, the next step is going to be to take your pocket piece that looks like this with a curve. You're going to lay it right sides together on top of your piping. And you can glue this in place or you can pin it in place, whichever you would like to do. I'm going to look at it from the other side. But get that in place. Actually, I'm going to just glue it right now. And glue that in place also. Doing a few steps at a time because they seem to follow so closely. But if I glue all this right here to where it lines up completely straight with this curve, get that stuck down really well with my edges straight. And now I can go back and continuing to use the same stitching like I did for stitching the piping in place with that presser foot. I can stitch using the little hump from where the piping is that I can tell that it is, and stitching along this line for the piping, I can stitch this pocket to the piping at the curve. So go ahead and take care of doing all of that, getting your piping in place to the skirt, and then stitching this front part of the pocket. This is actually the pocket lining to the curve after you've got your piping in place. Continuing on, we've got this all stitched together with the pocket curves and the piping is in between. The next thing that we are supposed to be doing here is trimming away this seam allowance, trimming about 1/2 of it away so that it's right about 1/8 inch. Just reducing bulk in this curve. Now that I have that cut away, I'm going to do a few little clips in the curve, which will also help it turn a little bit more nicely. Not going all the way to the stitching, but part of the way there. Okay, so now you can see that will straighten out really nicely since we've done that. And then the next thing is to iron it back this way. So get to the ironing board, and once you press it, it will be a really nice curve with piping right on the edge. I have already done that on this one, you can see. So after you've done the clipping and the turning and pressing, the next thing is to add the next piece of the pocket. So make sure that you're getting right sides together and lining up your curves here. I don't know if you can see that very well. The curve lines up here and the side seams and top seam line up. If I lift it up, you can see that everything is lined up there pretty well. And I am going to pin all the way around. This is the next stitching that we are going to do. Now as I'm stitching this, I'm only going to be stitching just the pocket pieces. It is not stitched down into the skirt fabric. It is just going to be this pocket curve that is stitched. So I pin this all the way around, then I can take it to the machine. Next, oops, sticking myself. After that is done, then I'm going to stitch all the way around this curve from corner to corner going around there, but I'm not doing any stitching on the actual fabric of the skirt. This is just going to create the pocket right there. So that's the next things to do, and be back in a minute and do the next step. Continuing on, this stitching has been completed here. I also finished the edge of this. You don't have to do that, but I did because I like to do that. Anyway, once you turn it over to the right side, you've got this pretty little pocket here, pocket curve. And the next thing to do from the instructions, the last thing to do as far as the pockets at this point, is to do some basting stitches right up here, just to keep this from flopping around, keep it nice and flat as you move along to do the next stitches. So you're going to have some basting stitches right through here and also here on both sides. Moving on to step 17 for the construction of the skirt. Got our pockets all completed up here, and we are ready to stitch the skirt front and back together. So this is the front that I have laying down here with the right side up, and here's my skirt back. All we're going to do on this step is line up your side seams nicely here, pin in place on both edges, and stitch. And then after you've stitched, finish this seam. Actually, you can just press it open if you like. I like to finish it, so I'm going to serge it, but you could also zigzag if you would like. So both side seams on your outside skirt, and then also do the same thing with your skirt linings for the front and the back linings for your skirt. And get your seams finished the way you'd like to do that, and then we will move to the next step. So here's the stitch side seam. I also went ahead and pressed it, and I pressed my seam towards the back of the dress on the outside fabric. Also did the same with my lining fabric, except for my lining fabric, I pressed my seam towards the front of the dress. That way, when I put these two things together, I don't have quite as much bulk right next to each other. You'll see what I mean once we do the next step. But the next thing that you do after you've got your side seams done and pressed is you are going to put your lining inside your skirt with the wrong sides together. So I am just going to open this up, put this in here, making sure that, my fronts are lining up with my fronts and the backs with my backs. And I'm going to start at the side seam. Now, if you can see right here, since my seams are pressed in opposite direction, they're just going to lie right next to each other, really nice and flat. So I'm going to do the sides to start with on both sides, getting them both matched up evenly. Glasses are necessary now for me. Okay, so now that I've got a couple of pins in each side, I can go to matching up everything else on the edge of this skirt. Now remember, we did these little clips where our pleats are going to be, and that's going to help us a whole lot now because we are going to match the clips from the front skirt to the clips on the lining, and they should line up just perfectly. And so I'm going to put a pin all the way around my fabric, lining up all of those clips so that my pleats end up being exactly straight. I'm probably going to end up going back and adding some more pins, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you. We are going to pin all the way around the lining to the skirt, making sure everything is lined up. You can see I've got my center point for my fronts there, and then I'm moving along right around, all the way around as I line up everything on the skirt. And you can see how nice it is here. All my marks for my pleats are nice and easy to see on the lining. So that's what we're going to use to see what we're going to do for the next steps, which is going to be sewing these pleats. So once you get everything pinned all the way around, everything lined up evenly, then you need to do a basting stitch all the way around the top of the entire skirt. It will be inside your 1/2 inch seam allowance so that you don't have to worry about that showing later. But this is just going to hold everything together so that we can treat these two pieces of fabric as one going forward. So take care of that step, and then we will move on to the next thing. So we have our skirts all stitched together, and I am going to break a little rule here. I am going to jump forward to the very end of the pattern where we hem the skirts. And I'm going to do this just because I personally find it easier to hem the skirts when I am not dealing with the bulk of the bodice and everything up here. So I'm going to go on and do this now. It'll be done when we get to the end, and we won't have to worry about it at that point. So if it bothers you to hem now, you can certainly wait until later. But I brought my little iron over here that's a little bit easier to do for the camera. And then I've also got this hot hemmer, and I'm really not sure if Susan has talked about these in any of her sew-alongs, but this is one of my favorite newer sewing notions that I have. It is it's coated, it's soft, almost feels like a flannel or felt fabric, but it's also stiff. It's a little ruler, and it is so wonderful for pressing hems. And it has all kinds of measurements on it. Actually, it doesn't have centimeters, just has inches. But what you can do, the hem on this dress, we're going to turn up 1/4 inch. So I have just got my 1/4 inch turned up here, and I can just press on top of this little ruler, and you can see just presses right down, and then I just move. And if I were on a regular ironing board, this would actually even go better, but the position I'm in now is maybe not quite as easy to demonstrate, but you can see how great this is because I can keep my lines up on this little ruler as I go. Really, really awesome. So for this outer fabric, for the pretty fabric, we're going to go with 1/4 inch all the way around for pressing it first. And like I said, certainly you can wait till the end of construction to do your hemming, but I like to do it earlier if I can for some reason. Just it's easier for me at this point than it is later. So I'm going to go all the way around with 1/4 inch, and I'm actually not going to do the whole section of it here, but I'll show you what to do next. This dress has a little bit smaller hem in it than a lot of the children's corner dresses. You turn up 1/4 inch, and then next we're going to turn up 1 inch. So I'm going to turn that folded edge up to my marking here for 1 inch on my hemmer. Get that where it's right at the edge. And now here I go with getting that 1 inch pressed in. So this is such a great tool. I really, really like it. It also comes in another different size that's more of a rectangular, squarish, rectangular shape with a curved edge. I don't have that one, but may have to be something that I try one of these days. I love this one so much though. So line up that pressed edge right here. It's a little bit harder right here at my seam line. But once you've got your edges pressed here, then you can hem this whichever way you like. Some people like to top stitch. You can hem by hand. I'm going to do a blind stitch on the machine. That's my favorite way to hem something quickly and where you don't see the stitches from the outside. So this one is going to be 1 inch. Now the lining fabric, remember we cut our pieces, our skirt pieces from the same actual pattern pieces, so they are the same length, but we don't want our lining to stick out or show at all past our regular skirt. So the way you get around that is you hem it a little bit shorter. So for it, my first hem is going to be 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to press up 1.5 inches for my second one, and that is going to make my hems, you know, about this much off. You can see that, where I'm going to have my outside fabric a little bit lower than my inner fabric. Also on the hem, I'm going to iron it the other direction so that my plain pretty side is on the inside. So I'm not going to have really any exposed stitches here on the outside. Now the inside hem for the lining you can do with a top stitch, or you can do with a blind hem, whatever you would like to do. I'm just going to top stitch it because it's not ever going to show. Anyway, so that's what I'm going to do next, and then after that we'll get to the pleats. All right, picking back up with the pleats. That's where we are in this process for this dress. Okay, so I have turned everything where my lining is up on the outside, because we're going to work from the inside of this dress now, which is going to mean the lining. And I've got all my marks for my pleats. And what we're going to do is just going to start with this one right here, and I am going to crease it on the crease line. So this one in the middle, if you'll remember, there were some pleat lines where we did little clips and they have arrows on them, and then there's a crease line in the middle. So I'm going to fold it on the crease line and bring these arrows together, lining up these little clips that I have right here. And then the edge of my crease is right up here at the top. We also have these lines along the pleat line here, and I like to make sure that they line up not only up here but down here, because it's easy to have this be a little bit off. So the way that I ensure that those are at the same place is I stick a pin in the end of this line all the way straight to the back and see how close I got. Now if you can tell here, I didn't get exactly in the dot, so I am going to take it out and just maneuver it a little bit. It can be a little bit tricky to get these exactly straight, especially if you're doing it on a stripe. I hate to say this at this point, but if you are choosing to do this on the seersucker, you have a little bit more of a challenge ahead of you than if you're doing it on a floral. But you can do it, and it will be a beautiful dress. Okay, I think we're going to make that good enough. So I am going to pin this in place, and then we're going to go to the next pleat and do the same thing. So I've got this one in place, and now we're going to go here. So here's my crease line in between my two pleat lines. Line up that right there where my clip is. And hope for the best on this dot. Now, get that fixed a little bit better there. This is a trial and error type thing. Okay, so I've got that one in place here. As I stitch these later, I will remove the pins as I go, but for now, they're going to be just like that. So I am just continuing to go around, creasing at the crease line and pinning together these lines. This one is actually right at the edge of the pocket. It was good first try. Didn't happen too often. Anyway, so I've got the front done here with these 3 pleats, and then I'll go to do the back. So the next thing to talk about, and you remember on the seersucker dress that I showed you, and then I also had the bright pink dress. The bright pink dress was done exactly like the pattern, where once I stitched the pleats in place, later on I came back and I took out those stitches so that the pleats were released and they opened up nicely right at the waistline of the dress. On the seersucker dress, I kept my pleats stitched in place down a little ways. And the way I did that it's really the same method of sewing. I just stitched along these lines and I back stitched here at the dot, and I kept those stitches in place. If you're not going to do if you are going to release your pleats, let me see if I can say this correctly. You are still going to stitch along this line at this point, but this is going to be a basting stitch. And then later on, you will come back and take out your basting stitch to release the pleat. So you can really do either one that you would like, whether it's a regular stitch with a back stitch here at the end of your pleat line, or if it's a basting stitch. Either way, go ahead and do that stitching now on each of your pleat lines that you have pinned. And you should have 3 in the front, and I haven't pinned these yet in the back, but you will have 2 in the back. And once you get all of these little lines stitched all the way around, we will come back and do the next step. Okay, at this point I have these pleats stitched in place along the lines. Got the ones on the back, and these are the ones on the front. The next thing that you do is you make the box for the pleat. So I'm going to take this line for my crease line, and I'm going to line it up with my stitching line that I just did under here, and just kind of flatten that out. And so it should match up just as exactly as you can get it. We're going to pin this in place. Now we're going to do some pressing, and we have got fabric marker on our fabric. And that's usually a no-no as far as sewing rules, if there are sewing rules. I'm not the sewing police, but there are a lot of people who would never ever iron over this. And I certainly understand why, because there are certainly instances where this might not come out and it would be a problem for you with your dress. With this being on the lining that's going to be on the inside, if for some reason it doesn't come out, it is not a huge problem. I wouldn't do it, I wouldn't be ironing over the front side if I had a lot of the blue marker showing through, but I don't. So I feel okay. And I really do need these lines to help line myself up. So I'm going to go ahead and iron. So I have just put that down. My stitching line is right underneath my crease line right there. And I'm just going to press and get that nice and flat there. Press down and then go to the next pleat and do the same thing. So my line here is lined up right there with the center of the stitching line, and I can do the same. I'm going to pin these in place, and then we'll go to the next one. We're going to take a good look at this from the outside before we do any stitching of these pleats, just to make sure that they look the way we want them to look. But I'm going to go around here with the next one. Stitching line straight down there. This would be easier on a regular ironing board where I weren't dealing with ironing through the back side of the fabric, but this works. It's working okay too. When you're doing it at home, it'll probably be a little bit easier. So I've got my box pleats. They're from the inside. They look pretty nice. You can see that there. Let me turn it around. So there they are. This is going to be the inside front of the dress. And I'm going to fold it back around, and we'll look and see how it looks from the outside. And I think it looks really cute. Needs a little bit more ironing, but that's what the pleats are going to look like from the outside. Now the thing to do before we stitch everything down, it's the moment of truth to see if our pleat lines match up with the princess lines on the bodice. So I'm going to grab the bodice just so we can take a look. Keep our fingers crossed here. If it's a little bit off, it is not anything to worry about too much, especially if you're going to make the version where you have the tie, the waist tie sash. But anyway, if I line up my side seam here, hoping that you can see this, but if I line up my side seam over here with this side seam, and I come right here is where my princess line is, and here is my first pleat. The center that I've marked from my bodice is right there at my center pleat. And then let's do this from this side so we can make sure it's going to go too. So there's this center, and it's also matched up very nicely with my princess seam. So we're okay here in the front. So that is good. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of the pleating in the back. I need to turn it back around the other way, where I'm forming the box and pressing it down. That's going to be the next thing for me to do. And then after I do that, I'm going to do an ease stitch all the way around. You would think that maybe you would just want to only base the tops of these, but what we really want to do is start at the back, and we are going to start about a ½ inch, you can't see that, about a ½ inch from either side of your center back line, and you're going to do an ease stitch all the way around the top. It's going to hold your pleats in place, but it's also going to be useful later after we put the placket in and when we're connecting the skirt and the bodice together. So an ease stitch means a lengthened machine stitch, and it needs to be a little bit inside of your ½ inch seam allowance. You're going to start ½ inch from the center back and go all the way around and end ½ inch on the other side of the center back for doing that. So it's going to do those two things. So finish up your pleats, and then do your ease stitching to hold everything else in place. Do some pressing, making sure also along the way that your bodice princess seams are lining up with those pleats. And then we will move on to the next step, which will be the placket. We're ready to get started with the placket. It is number 20 on the instructions if you're following along. I have my center back marked, which is this line right here. It is the halfway point between these two pleats. And that's this line that you can see, this shorter line right here. What the pattern is doing here, what it's telling you to do, is to move your placket over a ½ inch. It's going to help with the ease in the back of the dress to get everything just right in place. So the placket is actually a ½ inch off of center. So what I did is I have taken my marker, and from my center back, I have measured over and marked this line. And this is going to be where my placket goes along this line. There is a chart it is under number 21 actually for your instructions that tells how long your placket depth needs to be. This dress I'm making is a size 5, so it says that my placket depth is 3 inches. So from this line that I've made, which is 1/4 inch over, I'm going to draw a straight line down 3 inches from the top, all the way down like this. So that's going to be the line where the center of my placket. Now, the next thing to do is I'm going to make another line 1/4 inch over from that. And then I'm going to draw a triangle around the placket. We're going to go just exactly by the instructions on the pattern for doing this placket. So I'm going to draw a line from 1/4 inch over up to the top of my 3 inch long line like this. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. This happens to be the center back. It's 1/4 inch over from our placket. And I'm going to draw a line here for that line. Now, the next step, now that we have our looks like an inverted V to you, drawn, is I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch all the way up this side of the V. When I get up to the top, I'm going to do 1 stitch across that direction before I go back down this side of the line. So I'll have a V stitch here, 1 stitch, and then back down. After I have that completed, then I can come back and cut all the way along this center line up to the point where that cross stitch is right up here in the top of the V, and that's going to help me get my placket lined up later. So that is what you need to do at this point. Do your V stitching and then clip all the way up to that stitch at the top. Okay, you can see here I have my V sewn and I have it slit down the middle of that V. One thing that I didn't say that you can read in the instructions, but I didn't say exactly, and I probably should have, is when you are moving your placket over 1/4 inch, you're moving it over to the right. If you're looking at the skirt this way, I moved it over to the right 1/4 inch, not to the left. So Anyway, what we're ready to do now is get the actual placket piece out. And first thing to do is to take one of the long sides and press it over 1/4 inch. Once you've done that, you can bring it over to our skirt piece. And I'm going to put the right side of my placket piece and the raw edge at the top. And I'm going to line it up with the edge here of my fabric. A lot of times with plackets, your strip is actually going to be a little bit more length than you need for the for actually constructing the placket, and that's okay. Later on, you can get it trimmed away. So now we have this nice line that when I open up, I can make in a straight line, and it's the one that I did the stitching on. So what I'm trying to do is once I get to this middle point where I've got a little bit of a pleat and some more fabric to stitch, I'm trying to make sure that this line stays straight all the way across. So I'm going to go to the middle, and about 1/4 inch down is where my center needs to be. You'll be able to see once I get a pin in here, hopefully, that that is keeping this line here across here nice and straight. So it's actually the edge of this skirt fabric is actually angling down from here to here, but this line is straight. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to put some pins along the way here. And then I'm going to go to the other side, lining up this end. Over here. And then I can pin in between here and then get a couple other pins right here in the middle. Now, you can see I'm going to be able to start over here and stitch all the way across this line. Once I get to this space right here in the center, I don't really have as much room to play with because I need to catch, some of these threads right in here for that center part of the placket. So just stitch very carefully right along here, trying not to make a little crease in the fabric, but sometimes you will, and then straight all the way down. So go ahead and go for that next stitching, and we will come back in just a minute and do the rest. So now I have this piece stitched in place here. I've taken all the pins out. Just need to check and make sure that this little center area, that you've caught enough of the fabric underneath before you move to the next step, and that there's not a little gaping hole right here, and there's not on this one. And also looks like I'm not going to have too much of a pleat in that area. But anyway, the next thing to do is to get your little iron out, or your big iron, and let's press this seam towards the middle of the placket on both of these sides here. Okay, I'm going to do the other side also. We have a nice straight placket here. Okay, so it should look like this when you're done. Now I'm going to turn it over the other way, and the next step is to get rid of a few extra strings in there. Anyway, the next step is to fold this folded edge over to your stitching line. Press it down, covering up all of the stitches inside there. And you can either top stitch with your sewing machine right along this edge here on top of your placket. You can top stitch with your sewing machine all along here, or you can whip stitch it by hand. Whatever the case, this little piece of fabric needs to be stitched down next. Go ahead and take care of that, and we'll come back in a minute. Okay, you can see here that I have my placket stitched in place here. The next thing to do is to sew some stitches diagonally from about right in here down to the bottom of the placket. That's just going to help give a little bit more strength to this area and keep the pressure off of this little corner down here where, we only caught just a few stitches to get this stitched in place. So next thing is to do this stitching right along here. I've gone ahead and done that already. And you can see that when I open it up, it makes it into a nice V and a nice finish there. And that way the pressure is off of this spot down here and more onto the top area. So that's why you do that stitch. Plus it just looks nice. The other thing to do next is to go on and press this right hand side down, because once you get the bodice in place, you know, one side is going to lap over the other. The right side is going to lap over the left side. So it's going to be folded down, and then this one is going to be kept open and flat. It'll fold over like this as the dress is worn. So I think that's all to say on the placket. I think we're done and ready for the next steps. I'm going to have to find in my instructions where we are to go with that. Okay. Go ahead and take care of just that tiny little stitching down here inside of the placket and folding this over, and then we'll move to the next thing. We're at the point now where you need to decide whether you're going to do the belt loops or not, because that's the next step. If you're not going to do the belt loops, you can just watch this part and move on to the next step. But you know, the belt loops are a pretty permanent part of the dress once you put them on. And I understand that you may not want them on there, but you may still like the look of a sash. If you want to do that without the belt loops, that's certainly fine. What I would suggest is maybe looking on the blog at one of Susan's posts that she did, where she did a machine crochet little strip of, it's actually thread that she zigzags. And it's what we like to use a lot at Children's Corner for making loops for the buttonhole on the back of a bishop. It's also really great for belt loops. If you wanted, you know, on the side of your dress. You see this in ready-to-wear dresses all the time, where there's a little loop. I've got my side of my skirt here. There's a little loop that goes from, you know, this area up in here to here that holds your belt in place or holds your sash in place. So certainly if you want to do that type of belt loop rather than the fabric ones that we're going to do, that is certainly fine. But look on the blog and see if you can't find her machine crochet loops that she shows how to do. It's a super easy process, but that is an option if you don't want to do the belt loops. But if you do, there's some instructions on the blog for the size of this piece of fabric that you need to make the loops with, but I'm going to tell you now it's 12 inches by 1.5. Yeah, 1.5. And we're going to use this to make all four, and stitching up the long end of this. So you are going to fold it in half with your right sides together, and you are going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way up the long end, and then you're also going to stitch one of the short ends, and that's going to help you later as you turn your turn it from the outside to the inside. So stitch one long edge, one short edge, trim all of your seams to about 1/8 of an inch, clip the corners, and then turn it to the right side from right side out. And then we'll be ready for the next step. Have my long strip for my belt loop made, and I'm going to now press it with that little seam side on one of the sides. Now I said when I was talking about stitching this that you need to clip the corners there as you turn it. And you know what? That's really wasn't a necessary thing to say because we're actually going to cut that end off. We need 4 belt loops for this, and but we only needed the close end because that really helps you as you turn it from the inside to the out. So now that I'm done with turning, I can go on and clip that end off. So I just have an open tube here. What I need are 4 strips that are 2.5 inches in length. Let me move this board out of the way so I can cut on the cutting mat. But what I've got here is just a little, and get everything turned the right direction. I need it to be 2.5 inches wide. So I'm just going to use my little rotary cutter here and cut 4 strips. And that are 2.5 inches. Now the next step after you have these pieces cut in place is that you need to finish one end of them. It's going to be the end that's tucked under, so you just need to do a little small zigzag on your machine to finish one edge just so it doesn't ravel easily later. One end is going to be stitched actually into the waistband, but the upper end is going to be finished, and then it's going to be folded over like this and stitched in place to the dress. So one edge of each of these needs to be zigzag with just a tiny zigzag just to help with fraying later. So go on and take care of that step and then come back. All right, I have my 4 little belt loops made. I have one end that's finished with a zigzag, another end that is open. If you're concerned about this fraying in the future, you certainly could put a little bit of fray check on the end. I'm not going to worry about that right now, but you could do that if you would like. Do some fray check and let it dry before you put these in place. But there are 2 belt loops in the front and 2 belt loops on the back. And I'm just going to show you where they need to go and pin them in place. You will probably want to baste them in place later, but you're going to put the raw edge of the belt loop at the raw edge of the skirt, and they are placed on either side of the pleats that are on either side of the dress. You're not going to put it at right in the very center front. So I'm going to center this right over this pleat. It's going to line up right there and pin this in place. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side, lining it up with the edge. And it's going to be right here. After you have these pinned in place, if you would like, you could also baste them in place so you don't have to deal with pins in the next step. So we've got 2 in the front, and then we're going to have 2 in the back here. Some extra threads hanging out here to get rid of. Anyway, so the pleats in the back, each of them also has a belt loop. And that just goes right there. Make sure I can see to get it in the right spot. Raw edge matched with raw edge. And then one last one over here. This fabric is turning out to be a little ravelly in places, but it's okay. I've handled it a whole lot doing these pleats, and I'm about to get that bodice stitched in place, and there won't be any worries at that point anyway. So this last belt loop is put right there over the center of that crease line there. And like I said, you can baste these in place, or if you want to just keep the pins in there as you go to the next step, you can do that too. But so get those put in place, and then we will move to the next step. So if you're following along with the pattern, we are now on step 28, which is where we are going to get the skirt stitched to the bodice. So I'm going to begin right here in the center front with some pins, lining up my center front of my bodice with this very center pleat. And then I'm just going to move to the outside. Your pleats in your skirt should match your bodice seams or be very, very close. You go all the way around to the side, pinning things in place. Once I get all of these seams, like the landmarks for the seams and pleats, all pinned into place, then I'll go back and put a few more pins in between those areas before I stitch, so that everything will be held nicely together. So I've got the front back over to this side seam to get it pinned together. And here's this one. Everything's fitting together well for now. But once we get around to the back, there will be one side that we're going to have to ease in place. Now, this is the right-hand side of the skirt. It's the side that has the placket folded over. If you look at it here, it's actually going to line up pretty well, because I want this edge of my fabric to line up with that folded edge of the placket. So that one's going to be okay. No need to worry about adjusting the ease at all in this. And actually I should have pinned that down as I was pinning. Let's do that again. Okay, so I've got this side pinned in place. Now let's come over to the other side. Get this pleat lined up with the seam on the front. And now we're here. So, and it's actually pretty close too. Let's look at it from this direction and see. Looks like I am not going to have to use the E-stitching very much at all in this situation, so that's good. When I've made this before, there has been just a little bit of difference in the length of the skirt and the bodice pieces. And if that happens, all you do is you take this little thread right here, kind of like a gathering stitch, and just pull it up a little bit like this so that you get just a little bit of tiny bit of gathering or ease in there, and that will help the space fit together. Now, like I said, this one somehow worked out just fine where it looks like things are going to line up well. I've got one side open flat for my placket and the other side is folded over, and that's the way it's supposed to be. So I think normally it's the folded over side that you may struggle with the spacing on, but it looks to be okay in this situation. So now everything is pinned together. I am going to go back and pin a little bit more between these pins, but I'm only going to stitch the outside fabric to the skirt. My lining is down in here, staying out of the way. So that will be the next step to do. Be sure that you're stitching with your 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the skirt, and then we will press everything up at that point. Once you have it all stitched, everything will be pressed up towards the bodice. So let's get this finished up. Everything is stitched together nicely. I have pressed all of the seam allowances up towards the bodice, and I did also trim the seam allowances to 1/4 inch inside. Now, the next thing is to finish up these loops, belt loops, if you've done them. And I actually did this along the same time that I pressed everything up, but you're gonna have 4 of these. And what you need to do is press under the top 1/4 inch on that raw edge. And after it's pressed, then you're going to lie it down on top of that seam. I've still got my princess seam, lining that up straight and pin it in place. Now I am only pinning through the bodice fabric. I'm not doing through the lining. We are about to stitch these straight across. So they are all, you can see I've already got these pinned in place, and I'm just ready to do a little bit of top stitching across the top of that belt loop. If I come around to this side, you'll see that this one is already done. And I've got a 1.5 inch space here for my sash to run through. And we're gonna make that here very shortly, but the finished width of it is going to be 1.25 inches. So we have a little bit of space in there as well for getting all of that to fit through. So these need to be pressed up, 1/4 inch press under on that finished edge, and then stitched in place. After that, you can go ahead and whip stitch down your lining to the waistband seam. I've got this side pinned. Remember how we turned under the seam allowance already on the lining in a previous step. So it should be, if everything lines up, that it would line up, that press crease line would line up right here with your stitching. Pin it in place and see how it does. Sometimes you have to make a little bit of adjusting just to make sure that your lining isn't too tight or your outside fabric isn't too tight, and you can adjust that as you stitch along, doing the whip stitching all the way around. But you can't do that until you get these little belt loops done. So get them stitched in place, and then we'll do the whipping down. Let me tell you one other thing. Now with the seersucker dress, I did not have any problems, but I can foresee that it could possibly be a problem, that there would be a good bit of bulk right here in this seam because we have so many layers of fabric right here together. If it seems like it's hard for you to get your backside whipped down nicely over that, if you happen to have a clapper, that will probably help you in getting that press nice and flat. This is something that Bonnie at Children's Corner uses all the time in her classes. If you know her, I've taken anything from her, but it's a tailor's clapper. And what you do is and I'm probably not going to do it totally correctly, but you need an iron with a lot of steam, and you press very hard on your seam with lots and lots of steam. And then as soon as you let it off, you put this wood clapper down on top of it and hold lots of pressure for like 30 seconds if you can stand it. What that does is it forces that seam, all those fabrics, just right down as flat as they can be. And that should help you. And I realize I didn't totally do it with the steam or the amount of pressure that I could have done with a regular iron. This little iron's really probably not the best for that technique. But if you feel like there's just a lot of thickness right in here that you're struggling to get your lining whipped over, try that and see if it helps if you happen to have a clapper. Certainly just lots of pressure with your iron. Your steam iron right there will help with that. But like I said, I did not have trouble with it when I was doing the seersucker dress, and I really don't anticipate that this will be too bad. This is pretty much a medium weight fabric, so it's a little bit heavier than the seersucker that I was using was. Okay, so go ahead and get all of those steps done, and the next thing we're going to do after that is make this belt, the sash, and then we'll do buttons and buttonholes, and it will be all done. Let's talk about making this belt sash. This is my long strip of fabric. It is 3 inches wide, and this one is 58 inches long for the size that I'm making. I went ahead and folded it in half lengthwise with the right sides together, and I gave it a light press just to hold it in place because I think it's easier to stitch that way. If you want the end of your sash to have a diagonal stitching at the end rather than just straight across, now's the time to go on and take care of doing that. And all I do, I've got 2 ends together just so you can ensure that you've got the same angle. And it really doesn't matter what angle you use, but you can just cut all of it together at the same time. And now I have 2 matching ends that when I stitch are going to look just the same. Now we are going to, and you do want to make sure that the longer end is your folded end. So now what we're going to do is start right here and do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, stitching the entire length of this. But when you get about halfway, leave an opening about probably 3 or 4 inches, back stitch there, and then start again a few inches down this way and continue all the way to the end. Then you can use that opening in the middle to turn your sides out and turn everything to the right side. Now, of course, before you turn everything to the right side, you're going to need to trim that 1/4 inch seam allowance down to about 1/8. And then also you're going to need to clip these corners up here a little closer to your stitching so that you can get a nice, as good of a point as possible on this. So that'll be the next step. After you have that all turned out, you can go ahead and set it aside and do the buttonholes on your dress. Buttonholes and buttons are the last thing to do as far as the construction of the garment. And once you have that done, you can run your sash through the belt loops and see how it looks to you. If it seems a little bit long to you, like you would like for your bow to have a little bit shorter, strings on the end of it, then you can certainly go in, pull one side back out and shorten it if you feel like you need a little bit shorter. And that's just kind of a personal preference. Some people like those really long bows and others like a little more short, compact, neat bow. And it kind of depends on the size of your girl and the size of your dress and just your personal preference. But anyway, so go ahead and take care of making your sash, doing your buttons and buttonholes, and then checking the sizing on this to see if you like the length of it. And we will come back with a mostly completed garment. I guess I should say, once you've decided that you like the length of this sash, then you can go ahead and slip stitch that hole that you had created for turning it underneath, for running the ends through. Go ahead and whip stitch that by hand so that it will be all closed up. And then we will come back with our finished dresses here at the end and talk about what we've got. Here we are at the finish line with this dress, all done. Just think it's nice to get to see it on a little body form mannequin. I'm going to turn it around so you can see the back, how sweet it is. Something that I didn't mention as we were going along with the sewing, I mentioned that it was an option whether or not you wanted to release these pleats or keep them stitched. I sewed mine as a permanent stitch from here to here with a back stitch down at the bottom. But if you just basted, you can go ahead and remove these stitches that are in here, and that will release these pleats up to the waistline up here. So that was one of the last steps that I didn't mention to do, but you can do if that was your plan going forward. When I originally thought about this dress, I was thinking that the bow was going to be over on the side, kind of over on her left-hand side. And I do really, really like how it looks there, but it's also super sweet in the middle, like I did before. I'm going to untie the bow and I'm going to just show you the way that I tie a bow. For some reason, it's hard for some people to tie a bow, or they don't like how they do it, and I'm going to show you how I do it, and it's not always perfect, but just something else to learn if you would like to learn. So what I have, is my two sides of my sash coming out. I'm going to cross them over. This one that's in my right hand, I'm going to bring it underneath and back up the top and just kind of cinch that up where you want it to be. Now, the lower one that's hanging down is the one I want to make the loop out of, and I'm going to do it down here. And then the one that's already coming out of the top, I'm going to keep it out of the top. What a lot of people will do is bring it under the bottom, and that kind of makes it a crooked bow. But if you keep it up at the top and then do your loop this way as you come through, then you can get it pulled nice and adjust the size of your loops and the size of your strands, and you have a nice bow that looks just like that. This dress is a size 5, and the sizes, of course, I've set her on a PDF going along with the pattern. The smaller sizes have a sash that's 1.25 inches wide. The bigger sizes are going to have 1.5 inches. That means the loops are going to be a little bit longer as well, and that'll be a chart that's on the PDF as well. I think I mentioned when I was putting these on that I mentioned the sizes of them, but that's really just for the smaller size range. So if you're going to make a little bit bigger dress, I think it might be nice to have a little bit wider. It's not a lot wider, but a little bit wider might be nice for a bigger size dress. Anyway, I'm glad that you could do this sew along with me. I think it turned into a really sweet little dress, and hope your girl likes it, and happy sewing. Bye-bye.